In the heart of the Middle East, water is more than just a resource. It's a lifeline. Arable land is essential to agricultural economies and has been for thousands of years. When Umma and Lagash, neighboring cities, both nestled alongside the fertile Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, clashed over fertile fields on their border, a shared resource became a battleground. Lagash diverted irrigation waters to parch Umma's fields and attempted to choke off the other city's water supply. Chisels and shovels were replaced with spears and axes, and hundreds perished at the hands of their neighbor. 4,500 years ago, these ancient Sumerian city-states in what is now southern Iraq waged what some historians deem the world's first recorded military campaign over water, an ancient precedent for a very modern issue. Today, water resources and infrastructure still figure as both targets and weapons of warfare in violent conflicts across the Middle East and around the world. I'm David Michel, Senior Fellow for Water Security with the Global Food and Water Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. You're listening to a 6-part podcast exploring the dynamics of water conflict and the possibilities of water cooperation. This is Hidden Depths. I spoke with Marcus King, Professor of Practice in Environment and International Affairs at Georgetown University. In his book, Weaponizing Water, Water Stress and Islamic Extremist Violence in Africa and the Middle East, he identifies several different ways in which militant groups have utilized water as a deliberate tool, a weapon of war.
Beginning sort of at the broadest level is strategic weaponization, and that's the use of water to destroy a large or important area, targets. It might target a population or even an infrastructure. The next would be tactical weaponization, and I refer to tactical weaponization as the use of water against targets of strictly military value within a given battle space. Coercive weaponization would be the use of water to fund things like territorial administration or weapons acquisition, and this may be with the aspirations of achieving legitimacy. The other categories are unintentional weaponization. That's attempted weaponization that then causes collateral damage to its environment or to the human component of the environment. And then two that are very similar are as an instrument of psychological terror, where this can be used as a threat to deny access or purposefully contaminating water, and that would create a sense of fear among non-combatants. And very similar to that is water as an instrument of extortion or incentivization. This is the use of water provision to reward behavior of a subject population or perhaps to support the legitimacy of the perpetrator.
The modern Tigris-Euphrates River Basin, shared by Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, exemplifies multiple dimensions of water conflict on different scales.
So when Turkey started building its Great Anatolian Project, which involved the construction of 22 dams, 19 hydroelectrical plants, that meant that these plants and these dams will impact the flow of the water flowing down to Syria. And Syria objected to it, together with Iraq, saying, well, Turkey should take into account the other riparian states' needs.
That's Marwa Daoudy, the chair of Arab Studies and an associate professor of international relations in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. In the 1970s, Turkey launched its Southern Anatolia Project, an expansive hydropower and irrigation plan meant to grow its underdeveloped southeastern region, home to a large Kurdish majority. But many Kurds perceived Turkey's program as a form of coercion, leveraging the dam projects to enforce Turkish state authority and power over Kurdish populations. Beyond Turkey, downstream Syria worried that Turkey could utilize its dams to regulate water flows on the Euphrates River at will, strategically holding the Syrian economy hostage. To counter Turkey's growing control of the Euphrates, Syria intensified its support of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, also known as the PKK, a militant separatist group seeking independence from Turkey. The resulting bargaining between the two countries over the years explicitly recognized the weaponized role that water had come to play in the conflict.
In 1987, Turkey guaranteed a minimum flow of 500 cubic meter per second under the condition that the support to the PKK would be halted.
Turkey's conflict with the Kurds and with Syria took a new turn with the turmoil of the Syrian civil war after 2011. Kurdish insurgents in Syria, which also has a Kurdish population, took control in parts of the north of the country. To this day, Turkey fears that the Kurdish rebellion in Syria could inspire further unrest in its own Kurdish region and has weaponized water supplies to thwart the Kurdish insurgents.
More recently, Turkey, being one of the occupiers in Syria, has also cut water to some of the refugee camps in northeast Syria and some of the Kurdish areas in its struggle against what it perceives as the Kurdish threat. Having this autonomous region, Syrian Kurdish autonomous region, it perceives it as a threat and as an inciting sort of like model for its own Kurdish separatist movements.
Conflict parties may destroy water sources outright to deny enemy forces access to water supplies or to drive civilian populations to surrender or flee.
So the Syrian regime has clearly used water as a weapon in its attempt at, really repressing any dissent, any opposition, any rebellion throughout the years. We know also in the battle for Damascus, the suburbs of Damascus, the regime also, according to the UN Human Rights Council, purposely destroyed the Fiji spring in the Wadi Barada outside of Damascus, which is the main source of drinking water for the Damascus population, and because it was under the control of these rebel groups.
But, as Marcus King observes, there's another tactic at play. Some forces capture and manage water systems intact, leveraging them for military and strategic gains. By doing so, they transform essential resources into potent instruments of power and influence.
A key example from that is in Somalia in June 2018. With al-Shabaab as the militant group, they staged an attack on American special forces who had been deployed in an operation to liberate Somali villages in the lower Juba River region. And so by diverting the lower Juba River, al-Shabaab flooded an area that was under surveillance by American Green Berets and Kenyan peacekeepers. And so weaponization of water in this way forced Kenyan and American troops to relocate to higher ground, where members of al-Shabaab then ambushed them, killing one American soldier and 18 Kenyan peacekeepers as well.
King worries that both militant groups and state forces around the globe are expanding the weaponization of water in war.
You can see from the Horn of Africa moving west across the Sahel that there's been more and more use by extremist groups of the water weapon. And so both in Burkina Faso, but especially now with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and areas like Yemen, I really do think that they've emulated and they've learned some of the lessons that come from Al-Shabaab especially.
ISIS, the Sunni Muslim violent extremist group, grew out of the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq. In 2013 and 2014, the group capitalized on growing instability to mobilize an offensive that would eventually seize some 40% of Iraqi territory. ISIS weaponized water as both a recruiting tactic and a strategic tool to threaten populations and control territory. Peter Schwartzstein is an environmental journalist and non-resident fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. His book, The Heat and the Fury, On the Front Lines of Climate Violence, distills more than a decade of reporting from over a dozen countries tracing the paths of environmental conflict.
I mean, Iraq is a kind of grim laboratory for the connections between water and violence. Because so many of their senior figures had spent kind of years in the run-up to 2014 hiding out in these sort of little out-of-the-way villages or crisscrossing the Iraqi-Syrian desert in preparation for this onslaught that they were later to lead, that those years had given them a better awareness both of the extreme importance of water in the day-to-day lives of Iraqi villagers, but also of the ways in which that could be weaponized. They had seen these kind of petty village disputes. They had seen how issues could be either worsened or improved by the provision of that small extra bit of water. And so in the case of ISIS, I think that particular set of experiences had given them an acutely strong awareness of what it would take to kind of draw many of these already resentful, already grievance-ridden, extra poor villagers into their ranks.
For extremist groups like ISIS, seizing control of water systems became a strategic advantage. By operating these vital resources, the militants could generate revenue and solidify their hold on occupied territories, enhancing their operational effectiveness and influence.
So perhaps the most infamous example was actually from ISIS in their seizure and brief control of the Mosul Dam on the Tigris River upstream from Baghdad in 2014. So this action is strategic because it provided at least the theoretical ability of unleashing a torrent of water, which could have flowed downstream and destroyed the so-called Green Zone in Baghdad, where Allied forces were based.
For many Iraqis, the consequences of growing strains on the country's water resources have been deeply disruptive.
It's farmers, it's pastoralists, it's country peoples who are uniquely vulnerable to water problems. They're the ones whose livelihoods are most intimately wrapped up with water issues, and they're also the ones who, given the kind of thirsty nature of agriculture, need kind of most of whatever water is available. And so, yeah, in an Iraqi context, it's the farmers, it's the kind of the bedrock of the rural economy who are watching as their crops wither, their livestock sort of starve in many instances. But this is not a kind of uniquely sort of rural Iraqi kind of tale. In 2018, kind of most notoriously, about 120,000 people in and around the city of Basra in the far south of the country came down with waterborne or kind of water-related illnesses. You can draw a kind of a direct thread between declining safe water access and a rash of other sicknesses that are kind of overtaking kind of almost every one of the 40-something million Iraqis at some point in their months or their years. And then, I mean, it's getting a little bit more nebulous at this point, but you can draw a relatively direct line between that kind of worse water access and declining educational outcomes. A lot of both rural and urban Iraqis are having to spend relatively scarce disposable income buying in water, which in many instances means they can't afford to pay school fees or pay for uniforms or textbooks. And then, I mean, perhaps one final point here, and again, it's an even more nebulous one, and that's just the ways in which the kind of dignity, for want of a better way of putting it, of the average Iraqi is suffering because of a lack of water.
According to Schwartzstein, everyday Iraqis primarily attribute their plight to the inequitable water policies of their regional neighbors and the corrupt and incompetent water management of their own government, while still understanding that they are witnessing the unfolding impacts of climate change.
Perhaps the point that the average man or woman on the street will make most is they'll identify upstream dam construction in Turkey and Iran as the single biggest source of Iraq's troubles. And that's not wholly incorrect. It's certainly true that both of these countries have launched pretty energetic, pretty dramatic dam construction programs over the past 50 to 70 years, which have indeed contributed to a reduction in the flows of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the two great waterways on which Iraq has historically relied. But that kind of brings us into the second point, and that's rainfall. Now, even if many Iraqis, or perhaps most Iraqis, can't talk about drought and climate change in wholly scientific terms, there is still a kind of clear awareness that the rains are not falling as they once did. Lies the fact that there is just a sense among many of these communities that life is overly difficult now and it's only going to worsen. And it's made all the worse by the fact that not only is the state not working to kind of improve whatever water stressors it has the capacity to manage, It's also not looking to provide the options to diversify these rural economies and enable them to reduce their dependence on farming and herding, those professions that are, as we've discussed, globally uniquely vulnerable to climate and wider environmental problems. So it's an ugly picture all around. I mean, we're just not seeing the degree of action there, or anything like the degree of action that would be necessary for many of these communities to be sustainable in the long run.
Growing climate pressures could also contribute to incentives for conflict parties to weaponize water resources against adversaries.
The few of us that are engaged in this literature of looking at water weaponization have really been confined to these areas that are dry, arid regions. And there happens to be a correlation that these are the regions where there's also, jihadism and Salafist groups. But I think that we need to now open the aperture and think about other areas in the world where this practice could sort of metastasize, as I put it. Climate change is the key reason why time isn't on our side, that the global impacts of climate change, including higher temperatures, changes in precipitation, more frequent extreme weather events, even depletion of the glaciers, these are expanding the footprint of water stress, and then correspondingly the battle space where weaponization can grow in tandem with the spread of these effects of climate change.
Professor Daoudy also sees a grave erosion of international norms in the increasing targeting of water in conflicts across the region.
Really a case, we've seen Syria, other cases in Iraq and Yemen as well, where water has been weaponized, food has been weaponized, and famine created. What is happening in Gaza is an utter tragedy. You mentioned destruction. The United Nations has the ICJ has referred to it as a plausible case of genocide. We know the civilian toll is very, very high, almost 27,000 civilian casualties, including close to 12,000 children. Besides the genocidal aspect, there is a very, very high toll when it comes to the infrastructures, to the environment, to the water resources. But this is not new. It's worth noting that since 2006, since the election of Hamas in Gaza, there have been at least 5 major military operations by Israel in Gaza. And all of these operations have targeted water infrastructures in addition to civilians. So in that sense, there's been a history of destructions of water infrastructures, of impacting of the contamination of the groundwater, on which depends like almost 2 million people in Gaza. That groundwater major aquifer, the coastal aquifer, which is shared with Israel, has been contaminated by seawater intrusion for many years, has also been impacted by sewage water because there's been also a total siege imposed by Israel on Gaza since 2007, which meant that the population, the government could not import the material to rehabilitate its sewage plants, to clean its water, and creating a situation which is going to have also harm the civilians after the war ends.
Countering the weaponization and targeting of water will require sustained multi-pronged strategies. Among the greatest challenges, Peter Schwartzstein argues, are lack of political will and capacity in fragile and conflict-affected regions.
This is a situation that is salvageable. Were Iraq to plug those leaky irrigation canals and plug those urban pipes that are not fit for purpose, and to kind of reduce the amount of wasted water from its deployment of traditional kind of Sumerian flood irrigation techniques, then it would likely have more than enough water to go around, even in an era when drought is becoming kind of even more intense and more regular than it previously was. However, the degree of damage is so extreme, the amount of aid on offer is often so minimal, and the willingness to kind of, on the part of those authorities, to move beyond rhetoric and to actually kind of make many of the tough, perhaps politically unpopular, nitty-gritty, unsexy moves that would be required in order to adapt to climate change is again, it's not it's not there. The degree of action that is necessary is not playing out despite the kind of gravity of the current crisis.
Professor King emphasizes that both the conflict-affected countries and the international community will have important roles to play.
I think that what needs to happen with, let's look at the U.S. Defense Department, is identifying water stress as an accelerant of instability when putting together or composing national military strategies. Another part would be to invest in foresight tools a little bit more, like remote sensing, and being able to then identify areas where environmental factors are causing social instability. And then sort of a little bit more on the tactical level is applying this understanding to informing counter-extremism CVE actions, knowing where militants are likely to weaponize water ahead of time.
King also discussed how resilience-focused development assistance and climate financing can be a means of conflict prevention, as well as classic diplomacy. Marwa Daoudy likewise emphasizes the significance of holding state and non-state actors to international norms and accountability to protect both people and the planet.
And we have norms which say that targeting water resources is not acceptable in the context of armed conflict. Preventing civilians from accessing clean water and food is forbidden. Starvation should not be used. Also, there should be accountability, I think. If we don't make the perpetrators of ecocides and genocides accountable, any state will continue doing that in any war, thinking, well, there is impunity. When you think about the environment, it means the viability of these populations to return home and also to share a healthy environment, to have access to clean water resources has an impact on everyone. When we think about water security, it's about human security, it's about food security, it's about political security as well, and environmental security. So all of these aspects are intertwined, and I think we need to have a comprehensive and holistic approach to those issues, which could be the way forward to have really more sustainable and responsible norms applicable to everyone. And that would also save the populations, the civilians, but also the environment.
From international tensions between Turkey and its downstream neighbors, to the depredations of the Islamic State in Iraq and the still ongoing civil war in Syria, water conflicts around the Middle East have seen water resources deliberately targeted or weaponized as tools to pressure adversaries, threaten opposing forces, and control civilian populations. But tensions around the availability, access to, and control over water resources can also contribute to stoking conflicts between countries and communities. Join us next time as we explore questions of water as a potential driver of conflict. I'm David Michel at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks for tuning in to Hidden Depths. Hidden Depths is an initiative of the Project on Water Security, part of the CSIS Global Food and Water Security Program. Thank you to our guests, Marcus King, Professor of Practice in Environment and International Affairs at Georgetown University, Marwa Daoudy, the Chair of Arab Studies and an Associate Professor of International Relations in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and Peter Schwartzstein, Environmental Journalist and Non-Resident Fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. Hidden Depths is produced by Sarah Baker, edited with Emma Dodd, and narrated by David Michel.